Okay, welcome to the PowerPoint on toddlerhood and early childhood. So this combines material from chapters 5 and 6 in our textbook. And so I will talk about physical development for both toddlers and preschoolers, and then cognitive development for toddlers and preschoolers, and then social and emotional development for toddlers and preschoolers. And the last part of this lecture includes two special topics, one on attachment and one on child maltreatment, which will make up part 2 of this lecture material. All right, so let's get started with physical development. And when we think about the ages, so as we talked about during infancy, growth in developed and developing countries is actually pretty similar and fairly dramatic. And that's because during infancy, everyone is being breastfed. Once we get into toddlerhood and preschool years, we'll see that kids in developing countries have less rapid growth than kids in developed countries. Because now they're being introduced to solid foods, and generally kids in developing countries are, have less access to foods, and particularly less kind of high quality protein. And you've probably learned in other classes about protein deficiency leading to Kwashiorkor, that kind of swollen belly that you'll see little kids get, and which is also associated with a decreased immune system and challenges to physical and cognitive development. Kids in developing countries can also suffer from lack of iodine. We iodize our salt here in developed countries, and so if you're not getting iodized salt, then you might be more likely to have iodine deficiency. And then lastly, iron deficiency. Iron is found generally in meat or green vegetables, and lack of iron can lead to more anemia, which can make kids more tired, more irritable, basically less engaged in their own physical, social, and cognitive development. In developed countries, the main deficiency that we see is calcium, which is needed for bones and also muscle development in childhood. And dairy is often considered a good source, but there are other sources of calcium as well. Okay, so let's talk about illnesses and injuries during toddler and preschool years. If we first talk about it in a more casual, less serious way, those of you who've worked with little kids know that they are getting sick all the time, like colds, and that they are getting injured all the time. They're falling down. So, just the illness piece, kids haven't built up their immune systems yet, and so they're going to daycare or Sunday school or preschool or sports camp, and so they're getting exposed to germs, and little kids in those situations can be sick quite often. And then because, as we'll talk about, their gross motor development isn't that great, yet in terms of kind of balance and coordination, they're falling down all of the time. So injuries from activities are really common. I remember watching a dad walking down the street with two little girls this age, and the 2-year-old fell down on the sidewalk, skinned her knees, started crying, and he said in the most tired voice, "Oh, you got hurt again," right? Because it's pretty much a daily occurrence. And in fact, I can hardly watch my teenage daughter run down the sidewalk in flip-flops without yelling something like, "Be careful, don't fall," right? Because there was a time in our lives where we just bought Band-Aids from Costco in ginormous packs because every day we were putting on Band-Aids. So illnesses and injuries are common. Usually they're minor. But of course we could talk about things that are more serious, like causes of death. And so in developing countries, the leading causes of death are illness and disease. And we talked about some of those, even like malaria or dehydration due to diarrhea, other kind of illnesses. And then also accidents, whether that's drowning, fires, and also car accidents. So kids in developing countries, like we see in this picture here, might not be swimming in pools with lifeguards, although to be honest, I was often in a girl growing up in Florida swimming in alligator infested environments myself. So it's not clearly, that developed countries have completely safe swimming environments. But in general, the point is that there's more safety in developed countries. Buildings are built more safely. Automobiles and buses are more likely to have seat belts. We are more likely to have things like car seats. And so with these safety protocols, there's decreased accidents. However, in developed countries, the leading cause of death at this age is car accidents. You're more likely to die in a car accident in a developing country, surprisingly, because even though you're not as likely to have a car or drive as often, when you are in a car, it's less likely to be as safe as it is here in developed countries. Okay, so toddlerhood and early childhood is really characterized by basically synaptic connections and pruning in the brain. This time, up until the age 3 is considered kind of an intense time for synaptic connections in the brain. And as we'll talk about when we get to adolescence, this reoccurs during adolescence. So it's not so much that the brain is building more neurons during these ages, but it's really building connections, particularly in toddlerhood, but also into preschool as well. And so as you can see from this graph, the neurons that do exist are sending out, kind of creating more connections, increasing the axons and the dendrites to create more synaptic density. And then the brain begins to kind of follow that use it or lose it phenomenon and prune or, get rid of the connections that it doesn't need. So it's almost like the brain during the 2 years, 1, 2, and 3 is really kind of getting ready for anything. And then whatever it doesn't need, it kind of cleans out so that the brain can be more efficient. Okay, so a lot of the brain development is concentrated in the frontal lobes. And this is due in part to kind of all the emphasis on language that's happening, but also due to the increased kind of self-regulation that we'll talk about that is happening for kids at this age. You've learned about myelination, right? The kind of insulation that goes around axons to speed up impulses between neurons in the brain. And so there's continued myelination in all these new synaptic connections that have been created. And one area that's particularly getting myelinated is the hippocampus, which we've learned is associated with memory. And so the myelination of the hippocampus is one reason why around this age, people begin to develop autobiographical memory, which is basically your earliest childhood memories. And so you might take a minute to reflect on what your earliest childhood memories are. What I often hear from students is that it's something kind of traumatic in some ways, maybe a medical crisis like breaking your arm or having to go to the hospital or having a dog bite you, are often kind of the stories that people tell, but occasionally people have very kind of mundane things that are their earliest memories. Okay, so I hope you'll watch the film In Revel on the cultural focus, gross motor development across cultures. It's really great and shows kids at this age range around the world. And what you'll notice is that, for example, in some cultures, kids, especially developing cultures, children may be swaddled and carried longer into toddlerhood, both for safety, because maybe there's things on the ground that aren't as safe, but also for just cultural practices around childcare. Yet, interestingly, even if you're swaddled and carried quite a bit, your gross motor developmental milestones generally occur kind of at equal rates compared to those who aren't swaddled and carried so much. We do see variations in the gross motor kind of progression, as is noted in the film, but for the most part, kids are pretty comparable around the world in terms of developmental milestones. So in terms of gross motor development in toddlerhood and early childhood, kids start walking on their own generally around a year. Then they start kind of standing and climbing. By a year and a half, they're doing some running. They've already been doing some kicking, but they get a little bit more skilled at it by the time they're 2. And then as they move into the 3, 4, and 5-year-old years, they progress into jumping, climbing, throwing, running. They get faster, their balance improves. So we went looking recently as the teaching team to see what the research shows on kind of gender similarities and differences in terms of motor skills, both gross and fine motor. And what the research says is that at this age, girls and boys are generally the same, but we do see some differences in that boys are slightly better at the gross motor ability of strength, and girls are slightly better at gross motor ability of balance and coordination. At around age 2, we're seeing that girls are better at fine motor skills, using your fingers, but there's less of a gender difference by the age of 6. And we also see, at least based on this one study in the UK, that kids who come from families with higher SES, socioeconomic status, have more advantages in terms of gross and fine motor skills, perhaps because they're signed up for more activities because their family can afford those things, and so they're getting more gross and fine motor practice. Okay, so in the toddler years, kids begin to show preference for left or right handedness, usually around 1 year. And interestingly, they sometimes are showing this earlier due to their thumb sucking preference in utero. On average, about 90% of kids are right-handed, and it's been hypothesized that this is associated with the position in the uterus, that babies are often lying on their left side and so have less access to their left hand and arm and are more likely to suck the thumbs of their right hand. There's also some research that suggests that twins are more likely than regular siblings to be different in terms of handedness, with one being right-handed and one being left-handed, because twins are more likely to lie facing away from each other, not like little spoons. And so then we've got one baby laying on its left side and one baby lying on its right side. Left-handers are interestingly have more risks and more benefits. They're more at risk for verbal disabilities, perhaps because left-handers process language in both hemispheres rather than primarily in the left hemisphere. But being left-handed is also more associated with high verbal and math abilities and more strong visual and spatial abilities associated with being artistic. About 10% of people are left-handed, and most people are in the normal range in terms of these types of abilities, but we do see some exceptions. So then as kids, you can see there, they progress in what they're able to do with their hands. And people who work with kids are often assessing that. So even just family doctors, when you take your toddler or preschooler in, they will ask them to draw a circle, write their name depending upon how old they are. If you are a pediatric occupational therapist, you might be working with kids who are struggling in some of these ways. I know my son, who struggled with fine motor development, was assessed for how high he could build towers, and the occupational therapist was like, oh no, he's very deficient. He can only put 7 blocks on there, and kids his age can do this many blocks, right? And so some kids struggle more with the fine motor and might need some more assistance. There can be quite a range in kids' capabilities. Let's move from physical development into cognitive development. Okay, so if you recall, the sensory motor stage identified by Piaget extends from 0 to 2. So in part of this time period, we're still in the sensory motor stage. and we're actually progressing into substages 5 and 6. And substages 1 through 4 we covered in infancy. So substage 5 is from a year to a year and a half, and it's called tertiary circular reactions. And you remember back into infancy we talked about primary, which is repetitive actions the infant does with its own body, and then secondary, repetitive actions that it does with an object. Now it gets a little bit more kind of advanced in terms of those repetitive actions. And so this example of a child doing a shape sorter here is where it's kind of more complicated, right? They are trying different shapes into different holes kind of repeatedly. Or if you've seen a kid sit in front of the Tupperware drawer and pull out, you know, a bin and then try to put one lid on it and then try a different lid, and kind of all this trial and error that they're doing to figure things out in repetitive ways. And then kids also get more advanced in terms of their mental representation. So mental representations are associated with kind of Piaget's schemes, right, and memory, and building a mental structure for something in your head. And obviously we know that infants are doing this, but this gets more advanced in the second year. And so symbolic thought is being able to basically mentally manipulate things in your mind. And so the classic experiment that Piaget did with his kids is that he put his little kids in a crib or a playpen that had like jail bars, you know, and then because it was a long time ago, it had slats, and the child could reach their hand through the bars. You can't do that anymore, but at that time that child could kind of reach out through the bars in the playpen or the crib that was on the ground. And then what he did is he put a really colorful stick or rod outside the crib, and that if they turned it the right way, they could pull it in through the crib. And what he found when he watched his younger kids do this is, they, as you could imagine, they would reach out, grab that stick that was horizontal, and then, bring it up, try to pull it into the crib. And of course it would just bang against the bars, right? And it'd be like a lot of like bang, bang, bang before they began to turn the stick vertically so that they could pull it in through the bars. Well, Piaget then repeated the experiment with later children and waited until they were older, until they were 18 months old, and then presented them with the same problem. And rather than do all the trial and error of bang, bang, bang on the bars, these, 1.5-year-olds, and it was his kids named Laurent and Lucien, they would look at the stick, and then in one motion, reach out, grab the stick, turn it, and then pull it through the bars. And so basically what this tells us is they were mentally manipulating the stick in their mind, rotating until they realized, how they could get it in. So that's an example of symbolic thought. Language is also an example of that too. Deferred imitation just means imitating at a later time. So we know that babies, right, do imitation. When we say blow a kiss and we do it and then they do it, or wave bye-bye, we do it, they do it. Deferred imitation is more that you couldn't imitate right then, but you show imitation later. So maybe a child watched another kid have a temper tantrum, and then the next day they decided to have a temper tantrum too. And there's a series of studies done where a kid is brought into a room and gets to watch an adult like flip a switch, and something really exciting happens, like some pretty colorful lights. And then the child isn't given the opportunity to flip the switch that day, but they're brought in several days later, and then we find out, can they remember that if you flip this switch, interesting things will happen. And so basically kids are continuing to develop. The longer the delay is between when they have a chance to kind of take action, the harder it is for them to remember, but they'll get better, the older that they get at deferred imitation. And so this is why we might see kids, little kids doing things in their play that they saw somebody do in the days before. They watched a mom breastfeed, and so now they're pretending to breastfeed, or they watched a kid get in trouble and now they're disciplining their doll, right? That's all deferred imitation, which means that they've created kind of some mental schemes or memories around what they're experiencing. Okay, so you remember that we already talked about that. We know that infants can categorize just based on the habituation, dishabituation studies where infants will differentiate between plants, animals, vehicles, numbers, things like that. Toddlers will go further in terms of categorizing, and perhaps this is mental capabilities and also their gross and fine motor capabilities. If given, for example, a set of toys, they will start spontaneously categorizing, usually just one dimension at a time. So that if they were given these toys, they might put all the trucks together and all the cars together and all the boats together and all the planes together. They have a harder time when there's several different dimensions. So if they were sorting by color and shape, it would be hard for them to sort on both of those dimensions at the same time. Okay, so now we're in Piaget's pre-operational stage, which is ages 2 to 7, and we see advances here in kids' mental representations. We can see this in how they use language, which means that you're kind of using words to mentally represent things. We also see it in the pretend play, right here, let's have a tea party, or let's play school, or let's play, mama or dada and babies, or all those things that kids play. Yet kids at this age aren't as logical. They still will believe kind of magical things like Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny. They say things like, look, the moon is following us, not realizing that that logically couldn't be the case. And they make some key cognitive errors. And if you watch the Revel egocentrism task, which is short and I would highly recommend, it clearly illustrates these cognitive errors. So the first error that little kids make is called centration. And so centration means that you can't take in multiple pieces of information at the same time. You centrate or focus only on one thing, even when there might be other pieces of information that are relevant. So if you were to show kids a video of cars going around a racetrack and ask them which car is going the fastest, little kids, preschoolers, will just look at whatever car is ahead and they will tell you that's the car going the fastest. They won't maybe realize that there's a car coming up from behind that's rapidly overtaking the first car. Older kids will tell you, well, that one's in the lead, but this other one is moving faster, because they can take into account both of those pieces of information. Irreversibility is a little kid's inability to reverse a mental action. And so you'll see in the egocentrism film, they show them a picture with a cat on one side, or a horse on one side and a cat on the other side, and they flip this picture around, and little kids, when asked questions about it, can't mentally imagine it flipping back. They're struggling with reversing it. I also noticed just in quizzing Iris when she was little at this age, I would ask her, what's 2 plus 4? And she would think really hard and say 6. And then I would ask her, what's 4 plus 2? And she would think for the same amount of time, right? And then say 6. She couldn't kind of mentally reverse it in her mind and see that it was the same thing. Kids also show egocentrism, and this is the inability to take on a perspective of another person. This is why little kids don't lie. You generally start lying until you're around 4 or 5. Lying is actually a cognitive advancement. It's when you realize that what's in your brain can be separate from what's in other people's minds. This is called theory of mind, and we talk about it more in other HDFS classes. But so egocentrism at this age is basically that you think that whatever you know in your mind or whatever you are seeing, everyone else is seeing too. So I don't know if you've ever seen a little kid talk on the phone and then say something like, oh, Grandma, did you see that big dog come by? Not realizing that even though they can see the big dog, Grandma can't see the big dog. Or this is why I remember running into a 3-year-old on a playground on Father's Day, and he'd given his dad a fire truck for Father's Day because he assumed that because he wanted it, right, that's what his father would want too. And so again, kids don't lie because they assume that you know exactly what is in their mind. Another example that I heard from a student is that a child might stand in front of the TV and not realize that they're blocking everybody else, right? Because they assume if they can see the TV, everybody can see the TV. Okay, so watch the video on conservation tasks because it illustrates all of this really nicely. And so kids at this age, because they are centrating and they aren't able to reverse actions, can't kind of solve conservation questions accurately. So when they're given a scenario that looks like where they're shown liquid that is the same in A and B, and then B is poured into C, and then they're asked which glass has more liquid, A or C, they will say C because they centrate on the height of the liquid and they can't mentally undo what they just saw and imagine the liquid going back into B. And so even though the conservation of liquid experiments are the most famous, there's also conservation of number, mass, length, and you'll see some of those represented on the conservation tasks film. And so kids can get confused when you change, the mass of something, the ball of clay, or the length of a line. This is why when you go to Disney World and you see those maze lines, little kids can be fooled into thinking the line is really short, but older kids and adults realize that the line could be quite long, even though it doesn't seem to be taking up that much space. And so you can see that generally by the age of 7, kids understand conservation in most areas. And if you have access to little kids, it's always fun to do these kinds of experiments. Okay, so this was another Piaget experiment illustrating some of the errors of the pre-operational stage related to classification. And so Piaget would ask preschoolers, show them a picture like this and ask, are there more red flowers or more flowers? And 3-year-olds are more likely to say that there are more red flowers because they are centrating on the red color, and so that's one factor. And then the second factor is that this is basically a classification question related to hierarchy. Red flowers are a subcategory of all of the flowers. So there's a super category and a subcategory. And little kids have a hard time thinking hierarchically because it requires reversibility, right? You have to mentally first put those red and white flowers all in the same category, and then you have to kind of pull the red flowers back out. And so kids struggle with that mental manipulation. Okay, so here's a new theory that we haven't yet talked about in this class, and that's called Vygotsky's socio-cultural theory. Lev Vygotsky was a Russian psychologist living in the early kind of 1900s. And his theory was basically that cognitive development is both a social and a cultural process that children learn through their interactions with others, especially those that are older than them, adults and older peers. And so children begin to internalize basically the directives or rules of the culture around them, first in what's called private speech. And so you might see kids actually giving themselves visible or audible reminders in order to behave, so that you might hear them talking to themselves and say, be careful, or they might say, no, no, no. I remember watching my daughter Iris shake her head as she crawled towards the stairs or crawled towards the cat food and water bowls. She would kind of shake her head, no, 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 at the same time that she was, crawling towards them because she knew she wasn't supposed to play with them. And then private speech will eventually turn into inner speech. These are basically the inaudible directives that we give ourselves all the time to regulate our behavior, like hold the door or stop at the stop sign, stay in line. And so if you are with little kids, right, we are giving them directives all the time in hopes that it becomes kind of a regular part of their behavior. If you've ever taken a child trick-or-treating, for example, or watched parents of little kids trick-or-treating, right, they say over and over, say trick-or-treat, say thank you, right? You keep repeating this until kids make it a regular part of their behavior, whether that's something you can hear in terms of audibly or something that is happening inside their minds. And then scaffolding and the zone of proximal development I'll show you a little bit more on the next slide, but basically scaffolding, when you think about a building, scaffolding is a temporary framework that's used to help build the building. And so what adults and older peers are doing are they are providing temporary structures to help kids gain new skills. And we're always trying to do that within a child's zone of proximal development, the area where they need our help to be able to advance. And so let's talk about that on the next slide, and you can be thinking about how you've scaffolded kids. Okay, so ZPD here stands for Zone of Proximal Development. And so you can see that the zone of proximal development is what a kid can do with support from an older person, with some scaffolding. So kids all have what they can already do by themselves. So maybe this kid can feed themselves cereal and doesn't need your help, but maybe they can't, right, use a fork very well, or a fork and knife very well. And so you're having to scaffold that for them in hopes that eventually they're going to be able to do it by themselves and it will be their new independent ability. Now, of course, there's some things at a developmental age that it doesn't matter how much you scaffold, right? It's going to be beyond their zone of proximal development. So we can't teach a little kid algebra, right? No matter how much we help them in terms of scaffolding. But basically all of school is essentially scaffolding. We're trying to figure out what kids need help in, provide worksheets, provide activities, right, exercises to get them to the next level. And so when you think about how we scaffold kids writing, you know, we might draw lines out on a page to help them learn how to space out their words. Or if you have ever been a coach or a music teacher, right, when you just think of a simple soccer drill where you ask kids to stand and put their arms out and move away from each other until they're each, arm's length away. That's scaffolding that we need to be apart from each other on the soccer field to kick the ball, right? So that we don't just all bunch around the ball. Or the crossing drills that you do in soccer. You're hoping that if we drill it over and over, eventually it will become a new independent ability that kids can do on a soccer field. So you've probably been you can already be thinking of things that how you've scaffolded kids. It can be even simple things like how do you tie your shoes or how do you zip up your jacket. I will tell you from a parent's perspective that it's always challenging to figure out whether to do it yourself if you're in a hurry for them or to scaffold, right? So you're trying to race out the door, your kid can't get their jacket zipped up. Do you scaffold it? Do you say, okay, pull out the little tab, stick it back in again, wiggle it, jiggle it, let's try it again? Or, do you just reach over and zip it up? Obviously, in the short term, it's easier to do it for them, but in the long term, it's better if we can kind of teach them these skills. So let's talk more about preschool. So in developed countries, about 75% of kids ages 3 to 5 attend preschool. In developing, those numbers are lower but rising. And in general, there appear to be cognitive benefits to attending preschool. You have higher verbal skills, better performance on memory tests. And this is especially for kids who are coming from lower income households who may not be having parents who can spend as much time kind of providing enriching activities. Preschool graduates, for example, are more likely to graduate high school and go on to college. In terms of socially, generally there are also benefits. Kids are more independent, more confident. However, they can also be comfortable in environments that might speak out more and be perceived as disruptive. What is often said about preschool and daycare is that quality is really key, and quality in the United States is really tied to your socioeconomic status, kind of what you can afford. Other countries subsidize early child care more than we do in the United States, and so it is more even. Some examples of quality are the education of the teachers, kind of what's their level of training, do they have bachelor's degrees, do they have master's degrees, what's the class size and the child-teacher ratio, and what's the active engagement in learning. So we are generally going for hands-on at this age. We're not giving kids workshops or worksheets, right? We're giving them ways to kind of have some initiative and some autonomy and kind of act in their environment and try to kind of figure things out. And also, what is the quality of teacher-child interactions. So are teachers frequently kind of scaffolding and supporting kids' learning, or are they mainly just kind of keeping them in line or talking to each other about their weekend? So those are just some examples of quality associated with preschool. Okay, so even though we often say something like the quality of the preschool environment kind of influences the cognitive and social benefits, when we look into differential susceptibility, there's some evidence that suggests that, again, it actually depends. And so this was a research study of over 1,000 kids, and it was longitudinal. It measured their temperament from infancy through 6th grade, and then also their child care quality at age 2, and also basically how much trouble they were getting in 6th grade, their teacher-rated child behavior and teacher-child conflict. And what you can see here is that for the dandelions, child care quality is on the bottom there. For the dandelions, child care quality didn't really predict their behavior, basically self-regulation skills later on in 6th grade. It was the same whether they were in a poor kind of preschool, poor environment for preschool, or an enriched environment for preschool. But what you can see for the orchids who had, and they were the ones who had more of an irritable temperament when they were 2 years old, then it really mattered for them. If they were in a low quality preschool, then at 6th grade, they were the most disruptive kids in their class. And if they were in a high quality preschool, then in 6th grade, they were the best behaved kids in their class. So again, quality of early childcare really matters for later behavior, but mainly for sensitive kids, the orchids. So let's talk more about language development. So one thing that characterizes us as humans, and we see this even with toddlers and preschoolers, is something called infinite generativity. And this is this idea that you can be combining symbols, which in the terms of language is words, in an infinite number of ways and on the fly, kind of spontaneously. So when kids put together phrases and sentences, they are sometimes doing something that maybe they heard somebody say in that exact phrase, but they're also combining words in completely unique ways that they haven't ever heard someone say before. And so this is a feature of humans. So our primate relatives can produce signs for language, but they almost never make kind of original combinations of multiple signs. And so you could think that right now in this second, you could put together a sentence that had probably never been said, in the world before, right? So something like my little toe got stuck in my lime green flip-flop and now I have a blister, right? Nobody has ever said that before except right now. Okay, so language is associated with the left side of the brain, and Broca's area is language production, so making, whether it's sign language or speech, and that's associated with the left frontal lobe. And then Wernicke's area is language comprehension, so what you can understand, and that's in the left temporal lobe, on the side around the ear. And comprehension of language always exceeds production. This is also called your receptive language versus your expressive language. So children can always, and all of us can always understand more than we produce. This is why infants can understand words before they can say them. This is why you can read and understand the meaning of more words than you actually use in your everyday language. Okay, so let's talk about how language progresses in toddlerhood and preschool. So this slide just shows us from a year to a year and a half. Remember, most kids say their first word around a year. And so from a year, those first 6 months, from kind of beginning to use language, kids kind of have what's called a slow methodical expansion. They just kind of are adding a few words, a week to their vocabulary. To the point at about a year and a half, a lot of kids know about 50 words, and they're usually just saying one word at a time, which is, but they're often using it to mean more than just that word, and that's called a hollow phrase. That's where a child says something like up, and what they're saying is, I want to be picked up, or they say more, because what they really mean is, I would like more. My daughter Iris at this age would say, hold you, and I know that's 2 words, but she said it was like it was one, because she was often kind of, sitting on the floor with her arms up, and we would say, oh, do you want us to hold you? And so then she would just reach up her arms and say, hold you, which is what we used to even call her when she was little. We'd say, come over here, hold you. Kids at this age make some errors with language, and so overextension is using a word too broadly. So you may have heard little kids, a very common one is that they'll call all large vehicles trucks, right? And so then you have to be explaining, no, that's a bus, or that's a van, or that's an SUV. Or kids can also underextend. They're using a word too restrictively, and this is harder to detect. You don't really realize that they're making this error, but in the book it talks about, if your family cat is called Kitty, you might not realize that other cats are kitties too. You think it's only your cat. Or one of my students shared the example of when his grandpa called him Big Boy, he thought boy only applied to him. He didn't realize that others could be boys too. Okay, so let's continue talking about language between 1.5 years and 2 years. So this is where we're going to see some more vocabulary spurts, where kids seem to be producing multiple words in a day even. And kids use a technique called fast mapping to try to learn new words, to figure out what unfamiliar words mean. And this is basically using kind of clues in their environment and the process of elimination to figure out what an unfamiliar word means. So there was an experiment done with kids this age where there were 2 balls, a blue ball and a green ball, and the toddlers were asked first to bring the researcher the blue ball, which they did, and then they were asked to bring the researcher the chartreuse ball. And of course, toddlers don't know what chartreuse means. Even most adults don't know, but it's a color of green. And so, but they would use the process of elimination, and more often than not, they would, they know what a ball is. They know it's not this blue ball. They would guess and bring the researchers the green ball, so getting it correct. If you're talking to a kid who's pulling a cat's tail and you say something like, don't pull the kitty's tail, they think, okay, I know that this whole object is called a kitty, and so if I'm just touching this one part, this must be the tail. So they do some kind of process of elimination to understand what words go with what objects. Kids move from hollow phrases into telegraphic speech, which is where they're putting multiple words together, but they're basically leaving out the prepositions and the conjunctions and the adjectives. So they're generally doing nouns and verbs, and they're saying something like, instead of, can I show you this book, they will say, I show book. And kids do this in the word order that is appropriate for their native language. So in English, for example, they're going to say my cup, not cup my. If they were looking at a book with a picture of a blue dog, in English they would say blue dog, but in Spanish, because the color comes after the noun, they would say perro azul. So kids get the word order or the syntax correct, even if they're kind of leaving out kind of the extraneous words. And then they also begin to use their language to reflect their sense of self. So this is where we see more of or hear more of the I, me, mine, no. And then they also will start to refer to themselves in third person. And I think this is because we as adults refer to them and us in third person. And I think we do this instinctively because the you and the I get so confusing, right, with little kids, because they don't know, is I referring to me or is it you? And, vice versa with you. So we often say things to little kids like, does Isaac want more milk? Or hand that to mommy? And so then we notice that kids will refer to themselves in the third person. And so, I remember my son asking to watch videos. We were videotaping him, and he knew kind of that means we're making movies and then you could watch them. And so he would ask after being videoed, I remember him saying, I see Idic talk, right? He wanted to but he was referring to himself in the third person to kind of come watch the video. So another feature of kids' language, and as we move into years 2 and 3, is they start to demonstrate that they have some understanding of the rules of their native language. So kids start out with keeping, for example, all of their verbs in present tense and all of their nouns singular. And somehow no one has to tell them that if you want to put something in the past tense, you add an ed, or if you want in English, or if you want to make something plural, you add an s. Little kids aren't taught this, but they will start to add plural sounds or add different verb tenses. So kids start off saying, running up to you and saying something like, I run, and then they might transition to I running, and then they'll transition to I ran, right? But kids do something interesting in that they over-regularize verb rules. So we have a lot of irregular verbs and nouns in English, so instead of saying mouses, you say mice. Instead of saying foots, you say feet. Instead of saying goed, you say went, right? But kids will over-regularize that S to making things plural, or the ED for past tense, which is very interesting because they don't hear adults saying goed or dude or mouses or foots, but it tells you that they've unconsciously learned a language rule and then they're over-regularizing it. And then the syntax bullet point there is just that kids are still kind of getting the order of language and the grammar of language figured out. So pragmatics of language is about basically the practical use of language, and it also involves a lot of kind of politeness around language. And so children are basically learning what they can say and who they can say it to and how they need to talk to the people in their environment. So we start kind of teaching pragmatics when we have infants kind of wave bye-bye or blow kisses. When we're teaching toddlers things like say please, say thank you, let's take turns in talking. And then I think a lot of things that kids are learning at this age are what you can say to your sibling versus your parent versus your grandma versus your teacher. And so I remember watching my kids kind of figure this out, and so Iris was about 2 when Isaac was 6, and Isaac at that age, 6-year-old, was really into the word butthead, thought that was super funny, and so Iris is picking that up at age 2, and I remember her sitting at the kitchen counter in the morning for breakfast and looking up at me and saying, more milk, butthead, and I had to explain through my smirk that you can't call me butthead, you can call your brother butthead, but you can't call your mom butthead. Or having conversations with my son who got himself in trouble, like with a neighbor, kind of talking back defiantly, like, he was saying, you're not the boss of me, you can't tell me what to do. And I had to explain, we'll tolerate kind of some pushback, some back talk to us, but you can't back talk to other people, right? So trying to kind of explain the nuances of that. But kids also just start to figure this out. So I remember being with Iris one morning before school. She was like screaming at me, yelling at me, so mad, right? And didn't want to go to school, being really defiant. I'm not going. And then Gammy called, her grandma called, and she picked up the phone, just super polite. Oh, hi, Gammy. Are you going to volunteer in my classroom today? And I was like cracking up that this little kid could make that switch, right, between the two pragmatic forms of communication. So kids are figuring this out, and then definitely families and cultures have different rules around pragmatics. So if you're from the South at all, you know that there's a lot more like use of Mr., Mrs., ma'am, sir in how kids talk to adults. That's pragmatics. But even in terms of how much do families allow potty talk, right? Can you talk about burps and farts? And I remember having to kind of coach my kids that even though we allow some joking around about burps and farts, not all other families kind of want to hear that when you go play at their house. So here in the United States, we definitely see differences in language proficiency based on education and income. So higher income and higher educated parents talk more to their children And by even, 2.5 or 3, children in higher income families will have almost twice the vocabulary words as toddlers in low income families. So having that, it's often called maternal responsiveness because it's typically mothers who are doing kind of that verbal interaction. And basically what happens is that parents, whether it's mothers or fathers who have more education, repeat and extend what their kids are saying more. So they do affirmations like, yes, you want the bowl, or expansions. You want the cup. Can you say cup, please? Right? And so they're often taking kids' language, feeding it back to them, and having them go further with it. And so then what we see is that over the long term, these kids do better in terms of, even when they get into, standardized tests on verbal abilities in elementary school. Yet at the same time around the world, as we've talked about, there's varying cultural beliefs about how much you should engage young kids in language. Like how much do you talk to them, or how much are they kind of more expected to be quiet observers when they're around adults? Oftentimes in those cultures, kids are in the presence of adults a lot. Maybe they're being swaddled and carried around on their backs, and so they can still kind of learn language even if they're not getting a lot of direct interaction. Okay, so let's transition into talking about social and emotional development in ages basically 1 through 5. Okay, so the socio-moral emotions are also called secondary emotions, and these are all emotions that require a sense of self and other. And so you remember in infancy we talked about the primary emotions that emerge, and those don't require a sense of self, but emotions like guilt, shame, embarrassment, envy, pride, or empathy require a sense of self and other, so they don't emerge until the toddlerhood years. And there's different cultural perspectives on these socio-moral emotions. So for example, in individualistic, I should say, cultures like the United States, pride is seen as something that you want kids to feel, and shame is something you don't want them to experience. But in more collectivist cultures like in Asia, pride is perceived as more dangerous than shame, and it's healthy for kids to experience some shame because it keeps them kind of conforming to group norms. Independence is considered basically a little bit more dangerous, right? Because you might be then disrupting group harmony. Erickson's model of development, with his focus on autonomy and initiative at this age, is more representative of individualistic culture because he was thinking of shame and guilt as more negative. We just want to keep that in mind and kind of thinking about his model. So as soon as they're born, but definitely through toddlerhood and early childhood, kids are increasing their ability to self-regulate, especially kind of around emotions. So emotional regulation is part of self-regulation. And so they begin kind of using behaviors or language to self-regulate. So, grabbing onto your mom's leg, right, and crying and saying, I want that, dolly, right, is a way of a form of self-regulation. And so it's important to realize that emotional regulation is dyadic. That means that it happens in our other relationships. It's not something that kids are doing in a vacuum all by themselves. They're learning through their relational interactions how to manage their emotions. So, when they fall down and get hurt, is an adult saying, oh, poor you, owie, that must really hurt? Or are they saying, shh, it's okay, don't cry? Or are they saying, be tough, smile, right? All these things are how kids learn how to regulate emotions, and it really varies based on their family context and also their cultural context. Our expectations for emotional regulation go up as kids get older. So we don't expect, that a 2-year-old can stay quiet, in a concert, but we do expect that maybe a 7-year-old can stay quiet in a concert. And this can be challenging when you have more than one kid. So I remember, Isaac getting upset that he would get into more trouble for hitting Iris than she got into trouble for hitting him, right? Because I would try to explain it's different when a 6-year-old hits than when a 2-year-old hits. And then there's also variations by culture. around, for example, individualistic and collectivist cultures vary in how much they let kids kind of have loud meltdowns or temper tantrums in more public settings, or how loud or noisy they can be in these public settings. So, I've been places, for example, presentations where kids are present in individualistic cultures and they're allowed to be maybe a little bit more noisy, but that might not be tolerated in other cultures because that could be seen as more disruptive. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about emotion coaching, which is a really recommended parenting strategy, but not something that most parents do, at least not historically. And so the emotion coaching framework comes from John Gottman, who's really known in HDFS for his marriage research, but he also did some research on emotion coaching and emotional intelligence in childhood. And so, for example, Gottman's research studied parents who emotion coach and those who don't, and found that children of parents who emotion coach have actual better physical health, do better academically, have better peer relations, and seem to do better if their parents divorce. So there's a lot of benefits of emotion coaching, and this is something that I really tried to practice a lot with my own kids. And so I'm going to walk you kind of through the steps of emotion coaching, the 5 steps. So the first one is just becoming aware of a child's emotion. And sometimes this is really obvious because the child is crying and they're sad, or they're yelling and they're angry. But sometimes, and this is more of an example of older kids, not just little kids, but sometimes your kid walks in and their face looks a little off or a little upset. And so first you just have to tune in to the fact that maybe they're having an emotional experience, right? And say something like, "Are you doing okay? You look like maybe you're upset," And then the second one is seeing the emotion not as something that you need to make go away right away, like shh, stop, or wipe that look off your face, or smile, be happy, all of that. But see this as an opportunity for connection and learning, for kids learning about emotions and emotion regulation. And so this is a lot easier for emotions, that are more tolerable, like happiness or maybe even sadness. But it can be more difficult to think of an emotion as a learning opportunity when, for example, they're really angry at you, or they're really jealous, So it's one thing to, when they're crying, kind of use that as an opportunity to say, you feel sad. But, a challenging moment could be you're in the middle of your older kid's birthday party and your younger kid is having a meltdown because they feel jealous about the presents that they're not getting. It's hard in that moment, right, to see that as an opportunity and take the time to do some emotion coaching. When they're yelling something like, "It's not fair, he gets all the presents and I want presents too." At that moment you're exhausted. You've been working for days on this birthday party. There's so many details that you're trying to pull off, and you want to just be like, shh, no, we'll talk about it later. But you could use it as an opportunity to say, "I know, I bet this is hard, and you must feel jealous that he's getting all of these presents, and maybe we could make a list of all the presents he gets that you also want, and we can put those on a list for the next time it's time for you to have a present too." So something like that, right? Okay, so then step 3 would be, again, listening and validating a child's feelings. So trying to figure out what's making them upset, and then kind of in step 4 there, trying to help them put words to the feeling. And what's interesting about that is that you'll label an emotion for a long time before a kid ever uses the word. So jealousy was one that I labeled a lot. I felt like it was really important. It's something we experience every day, but it's not something that gets labeled. Shame is another one like that doesn't get labeled, but we experience a lot. So I was always trying to kind of look for those and put words to them. And I remember like the first time when Iris was probably 4 or 5, and she said, "I feel jealous of Isaac." And obviously I was sad that she felt jealous, but I was so thrilled that she could use the word and kind of own it. And then the 5th part is trying to set limits while exploring problem-solving strategies. And so this is I know you feel angry and you want to hit. What else can we do when it's normal to feel angry, but what else can we do, besides hitting, right? Having some limits. Or I know you feel jealous and you want to turn, but what can we do besides grabbing that from him? Now, again, it all sounds well and fine until you're in this scenario when you're trying to rush out the door to take your kids to your mom's house and one of your children is yelling, "I don't want to go. I hate grandma," right? And, you're like, "What? You can't say you hate grandma," right? You want to just shut that emotion down instead of saying, "You're really upset. You don't want to have to go. You feel really mad or disappointed that you have to leave the house right now," right? So let's talk about what we can do about that. So a really nice way to promote emotion regulation is the kids' books on emotion. And there's so many more now than even when my kids were little. And there's ones that are board books and shorter for, 2-year-olds, and then more advanced for, 4, 5, 6, 7-year-olds. I often give these as birthday presents for little kids. And so I'd recommend kind of checking these out or others that are popular. A common strategy in all of these books is that first they give a lot of examples of the feeling, and that helps kids realize kind of all the different kind of ways that emotion can emerge, and it also helps them know that the emotion is normal and that other people experience it too. Then they typically offer strategies for dealing with that emotion and kind of a reminder that that emotion is temporary, feelings come and feelings go kind of idea. If you're interested in any of these, you can go onto YouTube, and I love, for example, the Cornelia Maud Spellman books, the When I Feel Angry, When I Feel Jealous. You can search those in YouTube and you'll find someone kind of reading one of those books aloud. And so if you have time, I'd encourage you to do that. So again, when we go with this idea of parents and kids kind of learning emotions, then we can translate that into kind of our real world experiences. And a friend once told me that she had a powerful kind of light bulb moment in one of our interactions. We had both been taking our kids to a play, and we got to the place where the play was supposed to be happening here in town, and we weren't even going together. We just happened to be going to the same play, and it was canceled, and we ran into each other outside the event. And my kids, of course, were little and had been really looking forward to this, and we had kind of two different responses to it. I was basically trying to, in that moment, emotion coach with my kids. "I know this is so disappointing. You feel so sad, or you feel so mad. You've been really looking forward to this." And her stance was, "Oh, okay, play's canceled. Let's not feel any sadness. Let's go get ice cream," kind of distract and let's go get ice cream. And my stance would have been more like, let's name and experience the difficult emotion and then we can go get ice cream. And so that was kind of an interesting experience for her to realize that you didn't have to just be this happy cheerleader all the time, that you could kind of acknowledge and name more difficult emotion. So with emotional self-regulation that we learn and then practice throughout our lives, we are kind of going for kind of a mid-range level of control. So effortful control is basically how we can control our emotional expression and kind of the behavior that comes out of our emotions or emotional experiences. And so we could have under control, which then results in more externalizing behavior problems throughout our lives. When we're little, this can be like hitting our friends and grabbing their toys and having meltdowns. When we're older, this could be substance use, vandalism, violence, things like that. Over control means that we are not maybe expressing our emotion enough. So we're experiencing intense sadness or experiencing intense anger or jealousy or shame, and we're not letting anybody know that that's going on. We're not talking about it. We're not getting any support. We're really kind of shutting all that down inside. Internalizing behavior eventually kind of looks more like anxiety, depression, eating disorders, things like that. So what we want is kind of some mid-range effortful control. And I put this picture up there because you can see this older girl really wants to hold the kitten, right? But she's demonstrating effortful control by kind of waiting her turn, right? So we're kind of going for that mid-range. Okay, so let's talk more about gender development and specifically gender identity, sex type behavior, and gender roles and schemas. And we've got more information coming on each of these on the next few slides. So just as an overview, gender identity, which gets a lot of attention right now in terms of non-binary and transgender. But for little kids, they begin to have a sense of whether or not they are a boy or a girl, or male or female. And generally this is emerging around 2. So I remember sitting with Iris when she was 2 years old on the front porch and doing kind of quizzing her. I mean, she hardly could talk at this point, right? But I was asking her, are you a boy or a girl? Is mommy a boy or a girl? Is daddy a boy or a girl? Is our neighbor Julie a boy or a girl? Is our, pet, cat Pocket a boy or a girl, right? And so, and she could get it all right. So I was pretty amazed by that. And so kids then, once they have a sense of their identity, then they start to kind of exhibit sex-typed behavior. And this really varies, based on kind of culture and families and what is allowed. But sometimes parents don't always have a lot of control. So I remember Iris being, getting into the 3-4 age, and she was in a daycare, and all the girls were into, pink, purple, and princesses. And so for years we had to do pink, purple, and princesses, even though that wasn't something I would have introduced or encouraged. And then gender roles and schemas are around kind of what's appropriate behavior for males or females. And so we'll talk more about some of this. Okay, so we're seeing increasing attention to transgender or gender non-binary children in the media. And so in terms of being transgender, sometimes this can emerge at different stages of our lives. It could emerge in childhood, it could not emerge until adolescence, it could emerge in adulthood. But there are some kids who have a strong sense that they're not the gender that they have been assigned, or that matches maybe their genotype and their phenotype. And so I hope you'll watch this short video clip from Jody Patterson on raising a transgender child in the African American community. Really, so kids, when they're kind of having this sense of category of you're either this or that, they will say, I am not, a boy, I am a girl, or I am not a girl, I am a boy. And you can imagine that for little kids who don't feel like they fit the gender that they've been assigned, it creates a fair amount of distress. And so they're more at risk for depression, for anxiety, for self-mutilation, and parents' attitudes towards this really influence the outcomes for kids. So if parents can be more supportive and accepting, even though this is incredibly stressful for parents, then the outcomes for kids can be a lot more positive. Some of the language is shifting around, but it could be something like your assigned or declared sex versus your affirmed, gender identity. In some cultures, third gender or third sex has always been more accepted. It wasn't necessarily a binary. And of course, we're beginning to move beyond kind of binaries that you have to be this or that. When we think about gender fluidity or gender non-binary, we're allowing people to be both, neither, something else. So when we talk about gender, our brains kind of quickly go towards gender difference, right? And we want to know how boys and girls are different. And, that's important to look into. But what's important to realize is that we tend to have an overfocus on difference, and we often ignore similarities. So having read a lot of child development textbooks, I noticed that there's often a section entitled gender difference, and it's not called gender similarity and difference. And it doesn't say something like, for the most part, boys and girls are similar on all of these developmental issues, but there are some differences, right? It's just highlighting the differences. So it's important to remember when we talk about gender differences that on average, boys and girls are more similar than different in these 3 areas of development: physical, cognitive, and social and emotional. Okay, so as I mentioned, around ages 3 and 4, sex type behavior really increases, and you can watch this Rebel video on gender socialization to kind of give you an example of that. And so children start showing kind of gender-related preferences in toys, with girls doing kind of more dolls and art and crafts and dress up and pink and purple, and boys doing, more rough and tumble play, more cars, more trucks, those kinds of things. And so this was interesting for us because our son, Isaac, his favorite color from about 1.5 to 4 years was magenta because of Blue's Clues. There was a hot pink dog called Magenta, and so that was his favorite color. And so whenever he could pick a color, he always picked magenta, which created kind of some interesting conversations in our family and with our friends that we had a boy whose favorite color was essentially hot pink. And so I remember, our friends kind of questioning our decisions to let him have a pink and purple bike helmet or to have a pink and purple backpack. And it was very hard to find him any clothing that was pink or purple that didn't have like rhinestones and princess on it. And so my mom made him some clothing that was kind of pink and purple. But I remember the year when he was 4 and I bought him these kind of pink, hot pink Merrell Mocks because they were kind of androgynous looking shoes. But I said something to him like, if anybody makes fun of you on the playground or says anything about these pink shoes and they say pink is for girls, you could just tell them that boys can wear pink too. And as soon as I planted that seed to him that pink was a girl's color, he never wore the shoes out of the house. I ended up just having to return them. So kids start to become aware of what's appropriate and they start to match that. Parents, vary in how much they allow kids to show gender inappropriate or atypical play. Generally, fathers are the most disapproving of sons. So we tolerate more gender atypical play from girls and less from boys, especially dads. There's definitely evidence for both the environment and the biology in terms of sex type behavior. So the rough and tumble play that boys show does seem to be kind of correlated with exposure to testosterones and androgens, and girls who get more exposure to that prenatally do show more rough and tumble play. So it's not just socialization. And then it's also important to remember that there's a lot of within gender variation. So it's not like all girls are playing with dolls and all boys are playing with balls. We tend to want to kind of see them as meeting their categories. So I remember my aunt saying about my son when he was really little, oh, he's all boy, because he did love balls and to run, but she was kind of ignoring the fact that he loved pink and, he could talk about his emotions. Okay, so as they move into preschool, children agree that boys are supposed to play with cars and trucks, girls are supposed to play with dolls. They believe that boys are more likely to need to help dads, girls are more likely to need to help moms. Boys and girls agree that it's more okay if boys hit, or more common if boys hit, and less common if girls hit. They also tend to know, that firefighters are more likely to be boys, nurses are more likely to be girls. And as they move later in the preschool years, when we start getting to, 4, 5, 6, we'll start to see more segregation. Often not until the very early part of elementary school does it become really divided, where the girls are playing together and the boys are playing together. But it will start to happen. And I can remember, for my own kids, there were many years where they attended the birthday parties of boys and girls. And then like around 6 or 7, we would get a call from a parent who would say something like, I'm really sorry we can't invite Isaac because we're having an all girls birthday party this year, right? And I used to think that we should push back on that. We shouldn't let kids segregate by gender. We should make them kind of be more mixed. But what the research says is that the kids who kind of do the gender segregation, kind of follow those rules, are more accepted by their peers. And later on, as they get into the later part of middle school and then into high school, they will become less gender segregated again. Okay, so this is one of the more famous constructs in the HDFS field, developed by Diana Baumrind, many decades ago, on her research on basically white American middle-class families. And it's called Baumrind's Parenting Styles, and there's 4 categories you can see there: permissive, authoritative, authoritarian. It's easy to confuse those two, or uninvolved, also called disengaged. And these categories are built upon these two dimensions: the amount of demandingness that parents show and the amount of responsiveness or warmth that parents show. And in American white middle-class culture, we are often perceiving authoritative to be the best, that you both have kind of high expectations and you have high responsiveness. I think of this as being both firm and kind. If you are more authoritarian, then you are firm without all the warmth, and that's more of kind of the drill sergeant parent. If you are warm, but you don't have a lot of rules, that's, kind of more the permissive, laissez-faire parent. And then if you are low on them both, then you're pretty disengaged as a parent. And so when I ask students about their own parenting experiences, they will often say things like, well, I had one parent who was more this way and another parent was more that way, or maybe my parents changed over time. And my parents certainly did change over time. When I was younger, they were more authoritarian. And then when I entered middle school and my mom went back to school to become a marriage and family therapist, they became a lot more authoritative. So Baumrein's research on American white middle-class families, does show the benefits of being authoritative. And so kids who are raised with more authoritative parents, you can see there, have kids who are basically more competent, more creative, more confident, more socially skilled with their peers. Kids raised by more authoritarian parents appear kind of more dependent because they've been having to defer to authority. They can come across as more passive or more conforming. Kids of more permissive parents look more immature or irresponsible because they haven't had as many limits. They're more likely to conform to peers. And kids from disengaged parents show the worst outcomes, where they are more likely to struggle with impulsivity, behavioral problems, and kind of earlier, riskier behaviors. So once we start looking more broadly, both in the United States and in other countries, we see less of an emphasis on authoritative parenting, more of an emphasis on authoritarian, less focus on kind of responsiveness and warmth. So more emphasis on respecting kind of authority. In Asian culture, we can see this as filial piety. In Latino culture, we can see this as respecto or familismo. Some people have argued that responsiveness or warmth just doesn't look the same in maybe more collectivist cultures. That, for example, or even other cultures, that parents may be responsive by how they sacrifice for their kids, by how much they devote to their schooling or to their extracurricular activities, to working to give them a better life. And that might be how parents are showing responsiveness rather than so much in kind of a kind, tone of voice, for example. So given cultural differences around parenting styles, what can we say for sure can be harmful across cultures or beneficial? So once parents kind of move to be too kind of basically authoritarian to the point where they are kind of harsh, coercive, or controlling, then that generally has negative effects on kids' well-being, especially when there's an absence of warmth. And when parents, some shame might be healthy, but when parents become outright rejecting, that generally has negative effects for kids too. What can be positive is something called parental self-efficacy. And this basically is parents' own belief that they are capable and competent, that they, for example, know how to detect whether or not their baby is in distress and how to relieve it, or they know how to establish and enforce limits for 3-year-olds. So the more that parents kind of feel like they have some tools in their toolbox and have some competency, even though, we never feel like we've got that 100%, generally that has positive effects on parents' well-being and on kids' behavior. So the role of fathers varies around the world, and it's changing a lot. So in more traditional cultures, which is typically rural and developing cultures, we still see fathers in more of that kind of provider, breadwinner / disciplinarian role, and not so much involved in the day-to-day life and care of kids. But in more developed countries, or urban areas of developing countries, we might see fathers, be still perhaps more of an emphasis on being the breadwinner, but not all, and tend to interact less than mothers on a daily basis, more likely to play with kids than they are to do tasks like food and laundry. But again, lots of variation. But fathers are becoming increasingly egalitarian, whether that's, a single father family, a two father family, a heterosexual couple family. We're seeing fathers become more involved in the daily life and tasks of caring for kids. So your experience with your peers and friends when you're in early childhood varies based on kind of your cultural context and also your SES, your socioeconomic status. So in developed and more and particularly within developed, more affluent families, kids are more likely to be with their same age peers because they're getting signed up for the preschool and it's the 2-year-old classroom, or they're on the soccer team and it's the U5 team or something like that. So they find themselves with kids their own age, perhaps more. In developing countries or families with less money in the US who aren't doing as many structured activities, then you might be cared for with large groups of kids of varying ages, or you might be spending more time with extended family with kids of varying ages, or kids in your kind of community or neighborhood. And we can imagine that there's pros and cons. Some of the pros of having the same age is that then kids are at the same general cognitive level, and if you're a coach or a teacher, it's easier to kind of tailor what you're doing for this age group, or in the same physical level. But if you are in mixed age groups, that has benefits too. So being with mixed age peers, I noticed with my kids is that if the older peers were a positive influence, that gave your kids somebody to be a role model or to have as a role model, and maybe somebody to aspire to. So when my son Isaac was in a mixed age classroom, which was pre-K, first grade, he made a lot of cognitive advancements because he was one of the younger kids trying to be more like the older kids. And my daughter was in a mixed age daycare, all before elementary school. And so when she was the 1.5-year-old in that daycare, then the older kids helped care for her. And by the time she got to be an older kid, 4 or 5, she was helping to take care of the younger kids. So there more of that kind of compassion and caring behavior can emerge in mixed age groups. But of course, if you're a younger kid with older kids who aren't setting such great examples, then that can have more negative effects. So a student once asked me about the research on imaginary friends, which I had never seen in a textbook, and so we went to look it up. And there's a really small amount of research on imaginary friends, but they do happen in childhood, and they can be either basically non-existent or imaginary people, or they can be personified objects. So and if it's an invisible or imaginary friend, sometimes this is a version of a real friend. So one boy's invisible friend, was based on a little girl who was in his classroom at school, and he married the invisible or imaginary version of this girl, who then lived in his room, right? My son Isaac, when he was younger, made up a bunch of cousins that he had that lived in South America. So they didn't exist real people, they were just imaginary friends. And then you can have personified objects, which is like turning your dollies into, believing that they're alive. So Calvin and Hobbes, Calvin turning Hobbes into his personified object. What the research says is that the limited research says maybe 20 to 25% of kids have true kind of imaginary friends, and they often use them, as we can see from the Calvin and Hobbes comics, to navigate social interaction. So people don't always get along with their imaginary friends. Their imaginary friends aren't perfectly compliant. They can have disagreements, they can have conflicts, the imaginary friend can be unavailable. Kids might figure out how to deal with a bully by acting as a bully to their imaginary friend, or having their imaginary friend be the bully to them. Kids who have imaginary friends generally show increased creativity, more kind of fantastical thinking, and they can be more resilient because they're relying on an imaginary friend to fulfill some social needs, and so maybe they're not as subject to kind of, engaging with peers in negative ways just to have social interaction. Okay, so there's a few different types of aggression. Instrumental aggression is using aggression to get what you want, and that can be verbal or physical. So let's say a kid has a toy that another child wants. The child could be threatening or demanding in an aggressive way to get the toy, or they could hit them in order to get the toy. Relational aggression is more like teasing or damaging someone's reputation or ostracizing them through gossip. It's more about kind of verbal and power plays than it is about hitting or getting an object or getting a turn. Instrumental aggression, both verbal and physical, is pretty common among toddlers and preschoolers, and then starts to decline, especially the physical aspect, as kids gain more effortful control and self-regulation. Relational aggression, however, continues throughout childhood and into middle childhood and adolescence. And even kind of increase before they begin to decrease in later high school. And we'll kind of return to that when we talk about kind of bullying later on. Okay, so let's talk about television and devices and other screens. Again, I know we touched on this in infancy. So after the age of 2 and into preschool, research does suggest that educational programming can have positive effects for kids. Again, remembering that interacting with real people is always going to be better, but certainly the educational programming for kids like Sesame Street or Blue's Clues or Dora that teach either cognitive or social and emotional content can benefit kids. Entertainment TV like SpongeBob hasn't shown any effects, and certainly viewing violence or aggression or advertising has been shown to have negative effects. So we still want to monitor what kids are doing, and we want to limit it. And we also want to talk to them about what they're learning, because if we do that, it can kind of consolidate more the educational effects. And because screen time is correlated with obesity, we want to really prioritize physical activity. And in my family, we've always tied exercise into screens. So your ability to have screen time is really dependent upon whether or not you've gotten some exercise that day.